Hello and welcome. My name is Anthony Friz, and in this video tutorial series, I'm going to teach you the basics of writing iPhone apps. Now, of course, there are very many very good books on how to write iPhone applications, and there are also the Apple written guides that cover particular concepts for the different pieces of writing an iPhone application. But I think mostly everybody agrees that the best way to learn how to do something is to just do it. And in this instance, the best way to do that is to watch me do it while I thoroughly explain everything along the way. Now, I've been an iPhone developer for about 5 years since the original iPhone SDK came out in 2008 for iPhone OS 2.0 as it was called back then. And since then, I've made a lot of YouTube videos teaching the different pieces of writing iPhone applications, and some of them have gone on to generate a lot of views. In turn, I've gotten and still get a lot of messages and emails from viewers asking for help. And a lot of the time, a lot of different viewers are asking the same questions over and over again. So when I noticed this, I figured the next best move for me and my viewers would be to create a video tutorial series that starts from scratch with the very basics and progresses on to creating moderately intricate applications towards the end. So first, let's discuss what we're actually going to be doing in this introductory video. In this first video, we won't be doing any programming, and we really won't be creating any actual functional applications. What we will do is take a look at how to install the tools that you'll need for writing iPhone applications, and we'll examine Xcode, which is the name for the IDE that Apple has created to allow developers write Mac and iOS applications. And we'll try to become, at the very least, somewhat comfortable with the basics of using Xcode for creating iPhone applications. For this video series, I expect that you have at least some programming experience. Of course, we're going to learn a brand new language called Objective-C, which is the language you use to write iPhone applications, but we're not going to discuss the fundamentals of programming. So for instance, I'm not going to explain what a variable is or what an if statement is. If you do have no programming experience, it is possible that you'll learn these things along the way, but I would recommend learning at least the basics of programming with a simple language, maybe something like PHP or Java. And then once you feel comfortable with the fundamentals of programming, you can come back to this video series and really take a stab at learning how to write iPhone applications. So, Objective-C, the language you use to write iPhone applications. As its name implies, it's built on top of the C language. So all of the lower level functionality that C has, like addressing memory locations, Objective-C also has. But again, as its name implies from the word objective, on top of C, Objective-C has object support. So essentially, Objective-C is C programming with objects. So again, the language we'll be using to write iPhone apps is Objective-C. Later, we'll take a look at the technologies written in Objective-C by Apple, and those will be the frameworks and the APIs you'll be using for writing iPhone apps. Now let's discuss what you're going to need for this video series. First, of course, you're going to need a Mac. Unfortunately, Xcode, which again is the IDE Apple has created for writing Mac and iOS applications, is not available on Windows or Linux. So if you do not have a Mac, you're going to have to either borrow one from a family member or a friend, or you're going to have to go buy one. Next, you're going to need an Apple ID. The first reason you're going to need an Apple ID is so that you can download Xcode from the Mac App Store. To download apps from the Mac App Store, just like the iOS App Store, you do have to be logged in with a valid Apple ID. Xcode, fortunately, is a free download, and so is creating an Apple ID. However, if you do actually want to submit applications to the App Store, you have to enroll in the iOS Developer Program, which Apple charges a fee of $99 per year. But considering the potential for making money from the App Store, it very well may be worth it to pay that $99 a year. And of course, the last thing you're going to need is Xcode. So first, let's look at how to download Xcode. So again, first you have to have an Apple ID. If you don't have one already, you can create one in Apple's developer portal. We'll take a look at the developer portal in a little bit and see what it provides for you as a developer. So the link for creating an Apple ID is developer.apple.com/register/create-developer.action. So you can fill out this form, and at the bottom, click Create Apple ID. You may have to confirm your account by email, but once that's done, your Apple ID is created and ready to go. Once your Apple ID is created, you can navigate to the developer portal and download Xcode. The developer portal is located at developer.apple.com/iOS. Apple's developer portal does in fact provide a lot of resources to assist you in writing iOS applications. So for example, there is the developer library, which contains class references to all the classes you'll be using to write iPhone apps that come with all the different APIs you'll be using. Then they have some videos, links to other resources like a forum, and then of course, the one we're concerned with, an Xcode download button. So as I mentioned earlier, Xcode can be downloaded from the Mac App Store, and you can find it in the Mac App Store by clicking this button. Here we have a page on Apple's website dedicating to explaining what Xcode is. If we scroll down a little bit, you'll see a button in blue that says View in Mac App Store. When we click it, the App Store is launched. And you can download Xcode. Now see, I already have it installed, but if you don't have it installed already, this button here will be a download button. The latest version of Xcode, or the current version, is 5.0. And as you probably already know, the latest version of the iOS is iOS 7. So if you're going to want to write iOS 7 apps, you are going to need to download Xcode 5. But even if you aren't, I recommend Xcode 5 anyways, since it's the latest and greatest. Now it's time to actually get started creating our first project. So let's close both of these windows and open up Xcode. I have Xcode pinned to my dock at the bottom. I'm going to click it, and Xcode will open and the welcome window will be presented on screen. I haven't created any projects yet, so there aren't any recent projects listed here. We're going to click Create a new Xcode project to create our first official Xcode project. So first, Xcode's going to need some details about this application. On the left here is a menu for selecting the type of application you'll be creating. Of course, we're making an iOS application, so under the label iOS, make sure application is selected. And then you're going to choose an application template. These icons all represent different templates for different types of applications. So for example, one of the options is a tabbed application. A good example of a tabbed application is the music app that comes on every iOS device. If you open the music app, you'll see on the bottom is a tab bar, and tapping on each icon brings up a different view. Another example is a utility application. A utility application, as Apple calls it, is an app with two views. The first view provides the user with some very specific function, and the back view, usually presented by a flip animation, provides the user with some settings. A good example of this is the weather application that comes with every iPhone. We're going to stick with single view application. We'll take a look at all the things that are auto-generated by Xcode when we create this type of application and what they mean later on. So with single view application selected, click Next. Now we need a name for our project. Let's call it My First App. If you work for a company and the application you're building is going to be released under that company, you can put the company's name for organization name. But if you're a solo developer, you can just put your name. And finally, Xcode asks for an identifier for your company. Xcode uses the company identifier and the product name to generate a unique string called a bundle identifier. Every app in the App Store has to have one, so that the App Store and a particular person's iPhone knows your app from all the other apps. We're going to skip over class prefix and take a look at the devices dropdown. A universal application is an application that's built to support both an iPad and an iPhone appropriately. So for example, in a universal application, each piece of the application has a specific view for an iPad, a view that'll be larger and generally have more controls, and it'll also have a counterpart view for an iPhone, a view that'll be smaller and usually have less controls. Since we're sticking with iPhone apps, make sure iPhone is selected, and then click Next. Now Xcode's going to ask us where we want to create our project folder. I have desktop chosen. I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to click Create. So let's take a second and minimize the Xcode project window. And you can see on the desktop that a folder was created with the name My First App. This is what we'll call the project folder. It contains everything Xcode needs for building your application. The first folder contains all the resources. So for example, the class files, images you may be using for your app, a settings file, and even a prefix header file. Next is the .xcode proj file. This file essentially represents your project to Xcode. Opening it will open your project in Xcode. Finally, we have a folder called My First App Tests. We're going to leave this alone for now. So let's open up our Xcode Project window again. First, let's take a look at the toolbar on the top of the window. At the very top and in the center is the name of the Xcode Project file that you're currently working with. Again, for us, in this particular instance, it's myfirstapp.xcode project. Next, we have some buttons all the way to the left of the toolbar. First, a button that looks like a play indicator. This button is used to build and launch your application. When you click it, Xcode will compile all of your files, generate an executable file, install it on an iPhone device or the iOS simulator, depending on which you have selected here, and launch it. Let's take a look at how that works right now. So I have my iPhone connected, and by default, Xcode assumes that I want to build my app to my real iOS device. But for everything we do, we're going to be using the simulator. I'm going to choose the iPhone Retina 3.5-inch simulator. Now click the Build button. You can see in the center here, in the status bar, Xcode's letting us know, step by step, what it's doing to get your application running on the simulator. An icon was added to the dock, and it's called the iOS simulator. The iOS simulator works essentially exactly the same as a real iOS device. So the most efficient way to run iPhone applications is to test on the iOS simulator, and then when your application is finished, you can install it on a real iOS device and test it all the way through. But almost always, you'll find that the way your app behaved in the simulator is the same way that it'll behave on a real iOS device. As you'd expect, by default, our application is empty. By default, it simply displays a white screen. But at the top, there is the iPhone status bar. To the left, the carrier, and a Wi-Fi signal strength indicator. In the middle is the time, and to the right, just like a real iPhone, is a battery life indicator. So now let's go back to Xcode and stop our project. We can do that with this button that's directly to the right of the Build button. As you could guess by the fact that it's a square, it stops your application from running, whether on an actual iOS device or the simulator. Next is a drop-down for changing or editing a scheme. A scheme is essentially a bunch of settings that Xcode uses when building your application. So for example, one of the settings is how your app will behave when it's built for debugging as opposed to when it's built to be actually released in the App Store. We're going to leave this how it is for now, since in this case, and in most cases, the default scheme will be just fine. Next, as you saw before, we have a drop-down for selecting what iOS device or simulator you'd like to launch your application on. Again, at the top is an option that represents my real iPhone that's connected. And beneath that are all the different iOS simulator options. The first, the iPhone Retina 3.5-inch display, will mimic the Retina display that you find on the iPhone 4 and the iPhone 4S. Next, the iPhone Retina 4-inch display is made to represent what you'd see on an iPhone 5 or an iPhone 5C. Next, the iPhone Retina 4-inch, that also has a 4-inch display, but it has a 64-bit processor. This is the iOS simulator you can use to mimic the new iPhone 5S. It's the first iOS device with a 64-bit processor, and of course, all other current iOS devices have a 32-bit processor. And finally, we have iPad and iPad Retina. We're going to leave it on iPhone Retina 3.5-inch for the purposes of making our My First App application. Next, as we also mentioned earlier, is the status bar. Again, here Xcode will tell you the status of building and running your application. You can see that since we just recently stopped My First App from running on the iOS simulator, it's told us that it finished running it and there were no issues. So for example, there wasn't a crash or no exceptions were thrown. Next, we have two groups of 3 buttons, all the way to the right of the toolbar. The first button, which you can see is selected by the fact that it's highlighted in blue, configures the project window to look exactly how it looks right now. This is the default interface. Next, you can bring up the Assistant Editor, which we won't be using. And finally, the last button brings up the Version Editor. The Version Editor is used for source control, which we also will not be using. So let's leave it on the first button, since this is what we're going to be working with. The next 3 are for opening and closing 3 different panels. The first one is for opening and closing the File Navigator. The second is for opening and closing the debug window. And the last is for opening and closing the Utilities panel. You'll find as we go on that we'll be using the Utilities panel for every application we build. We'll use and discuss all the things you can find in the Utilities panel as we progress. Now let's take a look at the File Navigator. Here, Xcode lists all the files used for building your application. This includes everything from code files to resources, like for instance an image that you use to build your application. The root node in this panel essentially represents your project. It's labeled your project name, and beneath it tells you how many targets you're building to and the SDK version you're using. Of course, we're going to be using iOS SDK 7 for building apps for iOS 7. With this root node selected, you can see in the center of the project window a list of important settings that govern how your app will be built and how it will behave in certain instances. For example, the bundle identifier, or the version number, also the deployment target, iOS 7, the devices that this app can be run on, or for example, the device orientations your application supports. Underneath the root node is a folder or a group that contains some code files and an interface file. You can follow this pattern and keep all of your coding files in this folder. At the bottom, still inside this My First App folder, is a folder called Supporting Files, and as its name suggests, it lists a few files that supports the building of your application. The first one is a property list file. The meaning of the information contained in this file is generally self-explanatory. So for example, bundle display name. Whatever you have here is what your app will be labeled on an iOS device's home screen under your application's icon. The default value, which you can see here, is a token that tells Xcode to label your app the name of the project. In other words, in this case, your application will be labeled My First App. Next is the My First App tests folder. We won't be using this. The next folder is Frameworks. This folder, as its name also suggests, contains a list of the frameworks you're going to use when programming your application. The ones that we're going to be most concerned with are Foundation and UIKit. The Foundation framework contains classes you can use for managing, saving, deleting, and manipulating data for your application. So for instance, a particular class that exists in the Foundation framework is a class called NSArray. This is an object you can use to store an array of objects. The UIKit framework contains classes that you can use to make an interface for your application. So for example, one of the classes that comes bundled with UIKit is a class called UIButton. You can make instances of UIButton to place a button inside your application that triggers some action when the user taps it. As we progress, you'll find that these two frameworks are beautifully written, very easy to use. Honestly, they're fun to learn. You'll find a new appreciation for the developers working at Apple when you discover how easy to use but also how powerful these frameworks are. Finally, we have a products folder. When you build your application, Xcode's going to store it in this folder. A .app package is essentially a folder that contains an executable that the iOS device can run as your application and resources that the app will use while it's running. So for instance, an image. At the top of the file navigator is a series of buttons that when pressed provide different interfaces for you to navigate and search your files. The first lists your files. The next lists your classes as symbols. The third presents a field for searching your files. The fourth lists issues with your application, like warnings and errors, and so on and so forth. Now let's take a look at the center of the project window. Here is where you'll be building your application. If we select a code file from the file navigator, for instance appdelegate.h, you'll see that a text editor is presented in the center of the window, and here's where you can actually code. Likewise, you can also design the interfaces for your application. Opening main.storyboard allows you to create the interface for your application with a very easy to use GUI provided by Xcode. Again, as we saw when we launched our application, right now it's just an empty white screen. Next, again as we mentioned earlier, on top of this right pane is the Utilities window. And again, we'll learn all the nuances and the specific functions of this window as we progress and write more applications. At the bottom of this panel is a list of the file types and the objects you can create. By default, you may have the first button selected, which brings up the file template library. I had the third button selected, which brings up the object library. These are all the different user interface items that come with UIKit that you can create with the Xcode GUI in the process of making an interface for your application. Scroll down and look for button. Let's actually put something in our app. click on Button, and drag from the object library onto your application's empty view. Now you can save this and run your application again. This time you can see we actually have something in what was previously an empty application. Of course, clicking the button doesn't do anything, but soon enough, you'll have a functioning application with many different buttons, each which triggers a different action. As we continue on in the series, you'll learn to love Xcode, and you'll very quickly become comfortable with it. And you'll find that writing iPhone applications is sometimes as much of an art as it is a science. Well, that concludes this introductory video. Head over to video 2 to create your first real iPhone application, a Hello World app.